I see that a few people are finishing up lunch, but I would like to be prompt in beginning this afternoon session. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Karen Peterson. I'm the Director of Education and Public Programs here. I wanted to thank you all for coming today. I'd like to thank Katherine and Brianne and Tom for feeding our souls and our minds this morning. I want to thank symposium organizer Kathy Walsh for feeding our bodies at lunchtime. I was wondering if any of you, as you were sitting at your tables, had conversations and queried each other's passions for collecting and wondered if you were passionate or a bit pathological. We decided that probably Oscar the Grouch is pathological, but the rest of us are probably just passionate. This afternoon, we're going to drill down a little further to meet Electra Havemeyer Webb as collector and her collecting contemporaries. We're going to give each other the opportunity to ask questions of our speakers and of ourselves and each other. And we'll have the opportunity to investigate Mrs. Webb's collecting passions in depth with Senior Curator Jean Burks. I need to now put on my glasses. What I would like to do is remind everyone, and I will do this again at the conclusion of the gallery tour, but I would urge you and remind you to please fill out the symposium survey that's in the left side of your packets. As the first of a continuing series in programs, we would love to have your feedback on what worked, what we can do to make your experience even more enjoyable, thought-provoking, and what your interests may be in the future for these programs. We already, as Tom mentioned, have June 2014 planned, where we'll be discussing the colonial revival landscape. I'd like to take this opportunity now to introduce our next speaker, Elizabeth Stillinger. Ms. Dillinger is a writer and editor in the fields of American decorative arts and collecting. She lectures on the history of collecting American decorative arts and folk art, 1850 to 1976, and on such specific topics as American women collectors, early collectors of American ceramics, early collectors and dealers in and around New York City, early collectors of Shaker art, Henry Sleeper's Beauport, Helen and Henry Flint's historic Deerfield, and of course, dear to our heart, Electra Havemeyer Webb's Shelburne Museum. She is also a teacher, having taught courses on American decorative arts at the New York School of Interior Design, the Cooper Hewitt Museum, Fairfield University, and the Greenwich Historical Society. We look forward to hearing her insights on the woman who brought her passions here to Shelburne, Penny Stillinger.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I'm going to talk about these four people on the screen. I thought I was. Is that better? Yeah. Let me get this organized a little better. As you see, we have Electra Webb, and the three people that represent some of her collecting colleagues. She knew Henry Francis Dupont at least from the 1920s, probably before then, but she just became friends with Miss Ima Hogg and Catherine Prentiss Murphy when all three ladies were in their 70s. They pursued their friendship in person when they could and through long, chatty phone calls when they were separated. Although these four began their collecting careers in the early years of the last century, 100 years ago and more now, they had an enormous influence on many of us who came along afterward. It's only relatively recently that forward-looking curators began to get away from the look epitomized by Dupont's winter tour and the houses and museums of the other collectors. And I also want to say that I chose to talk about Electra in the context of these other collectors because she was a different kind of collector from her collecting contemporaries, and it shows how consistently she followed her own tastes and interests, and I think you'll see that throughout this lecture. So in looking at these slides, I think you'll see how our thinking about how people lived, worked, and arranged their houses has changed so drastically in the last 30 years or so that most of the period rooms we're going to see will look sadly out of date. I want to mention at the very beginning that the slides in which you see these rooms and period settings, oh dear, are old. And that's because the slides are genuinely old. They go way back to the years when I first began to give these talks, and I really treasure them because you can't get them anymore. And I just want to tell you that my daughter had to come out to my house in Connecticut from New York to convert the film slides to digital slides, and I did my best with them to sharpen them up and give them better color, but I'm challenged when it comes to using Photoshop. So I hope that you will tolerate these slides. So we're going to see these early slides and talk about the vision that they project of these collectors' idea of life in 18th century America. And many of us of a certain age grew up looking at these period settings, and that vision will always be a part of our mental picture of life at that period. We now know that life wasn't like that, but we will always remember these wonderful rooms at Winterthur and the various other museums. So the collectors we're going to talk about were all born during the 1880s. They were brought up at the end of the Victorian era, but they were still relatively young when the new fads and fancies of the Jazz Age swept Victorian manners and morals away. The social historian Frederick Lewis Allen lists some of the advance warnings of the Jazz Age of the 1920s. There was, he writes, the dance craze, which arrived about 1912, and which had set stiff-jointed elderly couples to foxtrotting and doing the tango along with their juniors. And there was the Armory Show of 1913, at which gallery-going Americans were shocked to discover such impenetrable styles as Expressionism, Cubism, and Futurism. The First World War also did much to disrupt and destroy traditional ideas and customs. Allen reported that by 1920, quote, the rebellion against Puritanism and stuffiness was widely visible, and it gained impetus as the decade progressed. While none of these changes was connected in any concrete way with collecting, the new liberated attitude had an important effect on our collectors. Their parents had lived in rooms overflowing with an eclectic assortment of Victorian furniture and exotic knickknacks. They may have had antiques, but they were probably not American. So when these collectors turned to American antiques, both they and their parents considered that they were being very revolutionary. In fact, Henry Dupont confessed that until his eyes were opened in the early 1920s, even he, quote, had always thought of American furniture as just kitchen furniture. I didn't dream it had so much richness and variety, he said. Another factor was that after the First World War, many Americans were fed up with Europe and things European, and this greatly increased their interest in things American. The 1924 opening of the period rooms in the American wing of the Metropolitan Museum was a critical influence on the development of, how do we get rid of this thing over there? The esques, in the American wing's period rooms, decorative arts were shown not as a mixed bag of relics and curiosities as they had been earlier. That is to say, there might be an exhibition table that would have maybe a stuffed owl and a Civil War sword and maybe some Staffordshire and some pewter. And these things would all be jumbled together with no explanation of how they went together, if they did, or what they were. Now, in the American wing, the combinations of furniture, silver, ceramics, and glass of a given period, in the case of the slide on the screen, the 17th and early 18th centuries, in a room whose wood and plaster work was of that same period, made people see American antiques in a totally new way. This is a watercolor that was made to illustrate R.T.H. Halsey's book, The Homes of Our Ancestors. Halsey was the man who put the American wing together. And you see here mainly furniture, not so much the silver and ceramics and so on. This is supposed to be a pointer, but it doesn't. But you can see the pot and the andirons in the fireplace, and you can see the woodwork and the plasterwork that are the same period as the furniture. So people now understood how these American antiques were relevant to their own history, and they began to see them as a way to give these things coherence as furnishings in their own homes by arranging them in some variation of the period room. Nearly 50 years ago, in an article entitled Artistic and Historical Period Rooms, Edward Alexander, who was then the director of interpretation at Colonial Williamsburg, distinguished between two types of period rooms. The first, which he called the historical type, was didactic, created of authentic or accurately reproduced elements arranged with as much historical fidelity as current research allowed. And the one on the left I don't know how that happens, represents that type. And it was put together by George Francis Dow at the Essex Institute in 1907. And the second type, which Alexander called the artistic period room, represented by one of Miss Ima Hogg's rooms down at Bayou Bend, was frequently also composed of authentic materials, but it stressed, said Alexander, quality, connoisseurship, and taste through, quote, placement, color harmonies, and lighting that will enhance the objects and please modern observers. The period rooms that we're going to look at today belong most definitely to the second artistic type. To furnish such rooms, 1920s collectors and up through the 1950s and 60s gathered examples of the best that had been made and used in America. In fact, they often stretched the point to include the best foreign accessories that could conceivably have been used in America, but probably weren't. And they combined their treasures with taste and flair. We'll begin with Henry Dupont, because literature influenced our ideas about early American rooms and furnishings just as the American Wing did. Mr. Dupont began to collect, he said, for two reasons. The first was that pine dresser that many of us have seen many times, filled with pink Staffordshire, that he saw here at Shelburne in 1923 when he was visiting the Webbs in the brick house. The second was what he saw when he visited Henry Sleeper at Beauport. That was Sleeper's house on Eastern Point in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and it was filled with furnishings most artistically arranged. So Dupont's motive for beginning to collect was aesthetic, arising from his newly awakened appreciation of the ways American antiques could be used to create vignettes or whole rooms that were symphonies of color and form like these. These two experiences inspired Dupont to begin to buy American antiques and interiors in 1923 with a view to furnishing the summer house he was building in Southampton on Long Island. There's that thing again. And you can see that vast exterior on the left and an interior which looks very much like the pine kitchen at Beauport. That is to say, it has plain wood floors, lots of hooked rugs, plain wood furniture, and various collections of china and pewter. Dupont called on Sleeper, who helped him with Chesterton House, again when he decided to furnish Winterthur, his home in Delaware, with American antiques. By this time, Sleeper was a successful Boston-based decorator, and so he was happy to help Dupont. And here you see two views, one of Beauport, the Octagon Room, and it shows how both rooms, both the one at Beauport and the one at Winterthur, are based on themes and the use of very artistically thought out colors. The Octagon Room, of course, has a theme, which is the octagon shaped. The whole room is shaped as an octagon. The center table is octagonal. The rug beneath it is an octagon. Those two things, the table and the hooked rug, were custom ordered by Sleeper. They were not old. Another theme in that room is tiger maple furnishings. He set, and another theme is red and gold, which you see in the bindings of the books, and the red and gold tollware. And he set all these things off against that wonderful aubergine color that he painted the paneling. And then at Winterthur, the themes are blue and white, which you see in the textiles and in the ceramics. Another theme is Queen Anne, which you see in the style of the furniture and the silver, and so on. So Sleeper and Dupont worked together until 1930, when Dupont decided that Sleeper wasn't authentic enough for him. And he wrote to Sleeper, "I am doing the house archaeologically and correctly, even down to the epoch of the fringes." Sleeper's interest was not in correctness, but in artistic effectiveness. And for this and other reasons, the two men stopped working together at this time. Nevertheless, Sleeper remained an enormous influence on Winterthur, and these dramatic decorative effects and the creation of rooms based on themes or colors remained prevalent at Winterthur. Eventually, period rooms from Boston to Houston relied on similar tasteful combinations of colors, patterns, and shapes repeated in several forms. So here's another juxtaposition of rooms at Winterthur and Beauport with these wonderful Chinese wallpapers in each case, and the use of yellow damask and so on. It was Sleeper's and Dupont's creative genius for decorating that caused both to search patiently for just the right piece of furniture, pieces of pottery or ceramics, piece of silver, and so on. And at first, if they couldn't find an old piece, they were happy to have a new one made up in an old style, until Dupont became interested in the epoch of the fringes. And so here you can see the pine kitchen. This is another shot of the one at Beauport, and the one on the right is the pine kitchen at Winterthur, which was taken down many, many years ago because it was not authentic. So in the end, even though Dupont insisted that his period rooms contain only authentic materials, they remained expressions of his very personal and romantic early 20th century idea of 18th century and early 19th century interiors. His real legacy is his unparalleled collection of American decorative arts and interiors, and his compelling demonstration of the beauty and interest of American objects at a time when much of the world found them crude and derivative. Like Dupont and Sleeper, Katherine Prentiss Murphy had a gift for decoration. In the period rooms she arranged at her country home, Candlelight Farm, seen here in photographs taken in 1950, at the New Hampshire and New York Historical Societies, at the Shelburne Museum, which we'll see a little later, at Ima Hogg's Bayou Bend, and at several other museums and historic houses. She expressed her own very voluptuous vision of life among early America's upper classes. It was characteristic of Katherine Murphy and of many other early collectors that the imaginary inhabitants of their carefully crafted rooms were always the best people. When she proposed her gift of 3 period rooms to the director of the New Hampshire Historical Society, she told the director that she intended to give rooms and furnishings of wealthy people of extreme good taste. I think the explanation for this proclivity is what I've been saying, that in the 1920s through the 50s, let's say, Americans were still very diffident about their own arts. They had been used to thinking of Europe as the home of true culture and taste, and even though they got discouraged with Europe as a result of the 2 world wars, this was a kind of ingrown feeling. So this view, of course, was heartily supported by the Europeans and by a number of the art-going American public. So to bring off the new notion of American antiques as having artistic value, it seemed necessary to these early collectors to prove over and over again that colonial and early federal Americans had been people of taste and culture. As a result, collectors such as Murphy and Dupont created these rooms that would have astounded their countrymen of 200 years earlier. Katherine Murphy also created period rooms to serve as backgrounds for the parties she loved to give. Her devoted retainer, Samuel, circulated during the cocktail hour, serving his famous whiskey sours in venerable pewter pitchers. Katherine set a sumptuous table with early 18th century silver, Dr. Wall Worcester, and ruby glasses. Her guests sat down in a romantic candlelight atmosphere to crab, lobster, and a splendid steak or roast, which she carved with a great flourish herself. She had a knack for successfully combining people from different walks of life, including such guests as Grayson Kirk, president of Columbia University, Hubert de Givenchy, the French couturier, and Carol Channing, the actress. Like their creator, Katherine's period rooms had a characteristic boldness. They were recognizable wherever one encountered them, which by the 1950s might have been anywhere from Vermont to Texas. Among their hallmarks were tessellated floors, which this was a theme she picked up from the painting Alice Mason, now at the Adams Mansion in Quincy, Massachusetts. Other Murphy hallmarks are fabric with the flame stitch design, lavish groupings of accessories such as pewter, Delft, and Staffordshire wares, rich oil paintings, and boldly curved and angled William and Mary furniture. Again, in the Prentiss Murphy bedroom at the New Hampshire Historical Society, we see Mrs. Murphy's delight in copying details from early paintings. Here from Copley's portrait of Daniel Verplanck, and if this thing will work, I don't know. If you can see the squirrel, can you see the squirrel and the little boy is holding the silver chain? That's his pet squirrel, and he's attached by a silver chain. So Katherine picked that up, and she has the figure of the little girl at the end of the bed with a squirrel on a silver chain. Katherine Murphy believed passionately in the arts and crafts tenet that just by looking at well-designed objects, people's taste would be affected. And she held the view that if she exposed people to good design through these rooms that she gave to the historical societies and so on, they would be aware that the shoddy manufactured goods that they might have been exposed to at home were no good, and that they should be looking at the kinds of things that she was showing them in these rooms. So for her, the priority really wasn't authenticity necessarily, but objects made in early styles. And like Henry Sleeper, she stressed the overall look of her rooms, and because her funds were limited as Sleeper's were, she was willing to sacrifice authenticity if she had to. It has turned out that many of her objects were too heavily restored to suit the exacting standards of later curators, and some were outright fakes. As in the rooms of Sleeper and Dupont, however, colors and shapes were carefully correlated so that Katherine's rooms created an impression of age and richness, and, by the standards of her generation, good taste. So the difficulty with Katherine's and many other collectors of that generation's beautifully coordinated rooms is that they left many people with the impression that in the 18th century, all Americans lived this way, and as we now know, no one did. From the 1920s into the 1970s, however, most of us accepted these collectors' idealized vision of the beautiful, tasteful world of 18th and early 19th century America, and that acceptance made it possible for us to think of the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries as ages of unassailable symmetries when no one had bad taste and colors always harmonized. However, in the 1980s, many institutions, including the New York and New Hampshire Historical Societies, decided that they needed to rethink their priorities and to focus on material that relates to their own regions and collections of local materials. because Katherine Murphy's rooms were romantic personal pastiches. Both societies felt they could no longer justify giving her rooms valuable space. They both took down the Murphy rooms, and those objects went to auction. So her legacy is intangible. In the end, it was more in the area of spreading enthusiasm for American decorative arts than in amassing a notable collection. She encouraged many friends and acquaintances in their collecting and research, and she inspired others, like the late Donald Shelley, who was for many years the director of the Henry Ford Museum. He told me once, he was a great admirer of Katherine Prentiss Murphy, and he told me that she had inspired him to do more. He said that she told him that he could do more than he thought he could, and he did. And she provided a comfortable and congenial atmosphere in which people from different fields could meet and exchange ideas and information. So here, how this slide got on the screen, I'm not quite sure, but this is Katherine Murphy standing and I'm a Hogg at Bayou Bend in the year that Miss Hogg turned her home, Bayou Bend, over to the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. She said that she became interested in American antiques in 1920 when she saw the Queen Anne chair on the right in the studio of the portrait artist Wayman Adams. He wouldn't sell it to her, so she went out and found another one, the one on the left, at the shop of Collings and Collings, which was an antiques shop in New York that was a very high-end shop in the 1920s. When she was able to finally buy the chair on the right from Wayman Adams' estate, she said she couldn't remember what it was that had made it seem so special to her, but she still acquired it, and it's in the collection there. Ima Hogg's brother Will shared her interest in American antiques, and some people say that it was he who was the more interested collector. But he died in 1930 when she and he were visiting Europe, and no one really knows for sure who was the more committed collector. When they built Bayou Bend, their home in Houston, in 1927, Will and Ima sent their treasures, their antique treasures, home to Houston from their New York apartment. Unlike Dupont, Miss Ima, as her friends called her, never felt the need to have genuine early American interior architecture, and the rooms at Bayou Bend are, for the most part, careful reproductions. That is to say, the architectural part of them, the antiques, are real. Ima Hogg's influence, however, was in the same area as that of Henry Dupont. She lived with American antiques in the Grand Manor, and she helped to pave the way for them in wealthy American homes. But since she was from Texas, she also conveyed her enthusiasm for American antiques to an area in which fine colonial and early federal period American furnishings were almost unknown. When I started collecting, she told Alice Winchester, then editor of the magazine Antiques, most of the antiques we were familiar with in Texas were Empire and Victorian. I wanted to assemble for Texas, as part of our heritage, the great examples our ancestors had lived with before they settled here. But unlike so many of her contemporaries, Miss Hogg did not scorn the Victorian furnishings of her parents' generation, as we can see in Bayou Bend's Belter Parlor, up there on the left, and Texas Room. The Texas Room is furnished with Southern and Texas pieces, and it has a set of Staffordshire ware that is decorated with the Texian campaign motif. In the late 1950s, Miss Ima presented Bayou Bend to the Houston Museum. She presented it to them, but she continued to live there and spent the next several years refining the collection and filling in gaps with the help of leading dealers and curators, including Charles Montgomery. It was during this period that she became friends with the other collectors that we've looked at, including Katherine Murphy, Electra Webb, and Henry and Helen Flint, the couple who restored historic Deerfield. Even though these collectors were by then in their 70s, they entertained one another with gusto, encouraged each other in their restorations and collections, and sometimes competed fiercely against one another to buy a special piece. Friendship trumped collecting rivalry, however, and Miss Ima added a Murphy room to Bayou Bend to honor her friend Katherine Murphy, just as Electra Webb did here at Shelburne. And you can see that Katherine Murphy had a good deal to do with that room. And here is a corner of the Prentiss house. There was a whole house here, there is, named for Katherine Prentiss Murphy, who also helped Electra Webb put this house together. By 1966, Ima Hogg had turned Bayou Bend into a series of period rooms furnished with fine examples of American antiques from the 17th century to the mid-19th, and it was opened to the public. While she was very influential in increasing knowledge of and respect for American decorative arts in her own region, Ima Hogg never became her collection, as many collectors did. She did devote stretches of her life to Americana in the 1920s and the 1950s, but she also devoted a great deal of time to music. She was a gifted musician. She studied music for years, both in New York, in Europe, and she taught piano for years. She founded the Houston Symphony, and she was always very active in musical affairs. She also devoted a great deal of time to mental health and to education. Her interest in antiques was genealogical and historical, as well as artistic. For while she was working on Bayou Bend in the 1950s, she also restored Varner, the Greek Revival plantation house her father had bought in 1901, where, at the end of World War I, the family struck oil and became really rich. Then in the 1960s, Ima Hogg validated her interest in Texas history by buying and restoring the Winedale Tavern, an old stagecoach inn that represented a regional style developed by early German settlers. She continued to add old buildings from the region to this property, and in 1965, she gave the Winedale property to the University of Texas as a center for the study of Texas German history and culture. Whereas Henry Dupont and Katherine Murphy undertook to show us the elite of colonial and federal America, Ima Hogg at Winedale and Electra Webb at the Shelburne Museum were among the first to show us the common man. Here is the Shelburne Museum as it appeared, as you can see in Life magazine, in 1953. This and the following pictures convey the central fact about this museum, that it is not just one building, but an outdoor museum with many buildings, a steamboat, a lighthouse, covered bridge, among numerous other artifacts. Founding and building the Shelburne Museum occupied Electra late in her life, as many of you know. She began to create the museum in 1947 when she was 59 years old. It is well known to this audience particularly that she had begun collecting about 40 years earlier when, as a teenager, she acquired a cigar store Indian. This was an act of courage for a young woman whose mother was a leading collector of French Impressionist and Old Master paintings. As has been told many times, Electra's mother, Mrs. Henry O. Havemeyer, referred to the Indian figure and other Americana that Electra insisted on collecting as American trash. And I was recently reading about Louisine Havemeyer, Electra's mother, and I was very interested to read that she wrote that when she was about Electra's age, she found that the art that she was attracted to and that she really admired was not the art that most of her contemporaries were admiring. She, too, liked things that were different from what her contemporaries liked. And I thought that was very interesting, and I thought that it was something that, that slipped Louisine Havemeyer's mind when she was judging what her daughter collected. Nevertheless, Electra maintained her independence in the face of parental scorn, continuing to collect Americana all her life. With the exception of Henry Sleeper, the other collectors we've discussed believed that they were creating period rooms that gave a true picture of life in early America. But Electra Webb never devoted much energy to that concept. In her museum houses, she arranged things as she had always done in her homes, combining and recombining objects and environments until she achieved an effect that satisfied her critical eye. As her son Watson Webb Jr. once wrote, certain things may be missing at Shelburne, which are part of our early American history. But if they are, it's only because Mother either didn't know of them or else didn't like them well enough to collect them. She collected completely by feel and love and by her intuitive taste and not by education or by any set of standards or by value. Period rooms were only one of the methods Electra Webb employed to display objects at Shelburne, and she conceived of them in a characteristically personal way. She furnished the rooms in each of Shelburne's period houses to reflect the geographical location and economic circumstances of a particular family, some entirely imaginary, some based on the ownership history of the house. Furnishing with a distinctive family in mind served as a way of creating cohesive interiors, she felt, and it worked remarkably well. It gave her a focus in selecting and arranging objects, and it gave viewers a context for understanding them. In this, Electra was led by her own intuition rather than by the practices of her collecting contemporaries, and it was extremely far-seeing. In 1953, no less a critic than Bertrand K. Little, then director of the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, now Historic New England, wrote Electra, "We were especially pleased and impressed with the Dutton House and how it has settled into its museum setting. It is without doubt the most successful and sympathetic moving and recreation of an old house that I have seen anywhere." That's quite an encomium from the man who was in charge of the leading institution in charge of the best historic houses in New England and the husband of the other great and leading collector of New England folk art, Nina Fletcher Little. She was the other person in the we of being especially pleased and impressed. It was also Electra's feeling, widely shared by today's museum professionals, but not by her fellow museum founders, that period houses should contain furnishings from several generations of occupants, rather than of only one period. Electra's aesthetic outlook was shaped by two important influences. The first was accompanying her parents and their advisor, the artist Mary Cassatt, on European art buying trips throughout her entire youth. And the second was growing up in a house whose interiors were designed by Louis Comfort Tiffany and filled not only with Impressionist and old master paintings, but also with glass, ceramics, lacquer, textiles, and prints from the near and far east. In the Havemeyer house, which was at 1 East 66th Street in New York City, floors gleamed with Hispano-Moresque tiles and rare Oriental rugs. Walls and ceilings shimmered with vibrant mosaics, exotic textiles, and stenciled designs. Stairways and banisters sparkled with glass, metal, and mosaic work. This is a peacock mosaic from the front hall, 1891, and Fevriel glass vases also from the 1890s. Nani Frelinghuysen has written a whole book about this house and its furnishings. The influence of these splendidly eclectic interiors can be seen both in the types of objects that Electra chose to collect, hooked rugs and quilts, for example. So when you think about hooked rugs and quilts, think about them in the context of a painting like this that has paint laid on in small units next to of unmixed paint laid down next to each other, of patterns mixed together, of these mosaics. And then look at this hooked rug. And I think you can see how her eye was affected by looking at those kinds of things. And here's a quilt, which reflects her exposure to the decoration of her house as she was growing up, in which small units of many colors and varieties of fabric are united, and it's just simply in a different material and in a different way, composed of elements that have the same intrinsic blending of layer upon layer of distinctive and varied components. Again, we have layer upon layer of pattern here, the way we have different patterns we had in the Japanese print, which is from the Havemeyer. They had a large collection of Japanese prints. Another element of Japanese prints in general, and this one in particular, is that the subject of so many of these prints was some aspect of everyday life, of common things that everybody was doing, in this case, bathing the baby. And this is very evident here at Shelburne, where the common man is so frequently represented. So we have layers upon layers of pattern here in the Hatbox Room. Again, in the general store, we have those little units of one thing set next to another, rows of small things juxtaposed. Again, in the miniature shop, Electra commissioned these miniatures in the 1940s and 50s. Besides early American quilts and hooked rugs, which we've already mentioned, Electra was one of the first to collect and display the hats. Oh, where have all these? Oh, I guess we're going to look again at the brick house before we talk about that. And we're going to look at we're going to go on to discussing the patterns, the juxtaposition of the different patterns in the hooked rugs here, the collection of the pewter objects, all the same material but many different forms, and the apotheosis of pattern on pattern in this bedroom. And here is where we see these things that Electra was among the first to collect: glass witch balls, hat and bandboxes, weather vanes, sculpture such as decoys, ships' figureheads, and circus and carousel animals, like this wonderful one. Her great love was, in fact, folk sculpture, and she used it to enliven her interiors in a most unusual way. Her grandson, John Wilmerding, told me that Electra, quote, couldn't buy things and simply put them in storage. They literally had to be arranged or installed. Her interiors were treated not so much as period rooms, but as things seen in juxtaposition. Every coffee table had arrangements, and things crawled up the walls or went around the floors or were piled up in bedrooms. Cigar store Indians paraded through the guest house, and here you see them parading. This is the guest house. You see them parading through the guest house, and then they went on, said Wilmerding, into the tennis court, where they were ranged around the ivy-covered walls as if they were timekeepers at the game. This is a picture of about 1940. Electra Webb was a pioneer, both in collecting American antiques that included a large percentage of folk art, and in arranging her objects to create interiors that were not really period rooms, but her personal evocations of an earlier America. She was among the first to treat unpretentious American folk and vernacular objects as worthy of inclusion in rooms that were used for formal entertaining. And because she numbered among her guests persons of wealth, sophistication, and power, her captivating rooms and vignettes were important in introducing both mainstream American antiques and American folk art to an influential stratum of society. But her legacy includes not just her amazing collection of folk and vernacular objects, but also the much larger remnants of an earlier America, the things that really I haven't devoted time to in this lecture. The steamboat, the hunting lodge, the covered bridge, things that either have or are disappearing. Among all the collectors I've studied over the last 35 years, I don't think I've encountered one who was more farsighted or courageous than Electra Webb. Thank you.